The most dangerous betrayals never arrive with a gun. They arrive disguised as a harmless glass raised in celebration. Crystal chandeliers bathed the grand dining hall of the Castellano estate in a warm golden glow, their reflections dancing across polished marble floors and rows of sparkling crystal glasses arranged with military precision. Every place setting had been inspected twice, every chair aligned perfectly, every candle burning with quiet elegance. Tonight's private dinner was meant to celebrate a partnership powerful enough to reshape the balance of influence across the city, and every guest seated around the enormous walnut table understood the importance of appearing calm, confident, and loyal. At the far end of the room sat Vincent Castellano, a man whose tailored charcoal suit and composed expression revealed nothing of the countless responsibilities resting on his shoulders. He lifted conversations simply by entering a room, yet tonight he spoke little, listening more than talking, while experienced executives and trusted associates exchanged polite laughter over expensive wine and carefully chosen words. Along the walls, security personnel remained almost invisible, alert without appearing intrusive, while the household staff moved quietly between tables, replacing plates, refilling glasses, and disappearing before anyone noticed they had been there at all. Among them was Naomi Carter, the newest maid employed at the estate. She carried herself with quiet professionalism, her dark uniform perfectly pressed despite the long hours she'd already worked since sunrise. At 28, Naomi had learned that the safest way to survive inside the homes of powerful people was to become almost invisible. She spoke only when necessary, avoided unnecessary eye contact, and completed every task with careful precision. But tonight, she wasn't completely alone. Sitting quietly near the service entrance with a small coloring book and a handful of crayons was her 2-year-old son, Elijah. The babysitter she'd relied on for months had canceled unexpectedly only an hour before her shift began, leaving Naomi with no choice but to bring him along after receiving reluctant permission from the head housekeeper, who insisted the little boy remain silent and out of everyone's way. Elijah usually obeyed better than most children his age. Curious but gentle, he often watched the world with unusually focused brown eyes, noticing details adults overlooked. While Naomi carried another silver tray toward the dining table, Elijah quietly looked around the enormous room, fascinated by shimmering lights bouncing across polished silverware. Then his attention stopped. His tiny face became strangely serious. Across the room, one of the servers reached toward Vincent's place, setting for only a brief second before stepping away with practiced confidence. It was such a small movement that no one else seemed to notice. Conversations continued. Glasses clinked softly. Someone laughed at the opposite end of the table. Music drifted almost unnoticed through hidden speakers. But Elijah continued staring at Vincent's wine glass without blinking. Naomi returned to collect an empty serving plate and smiled gently toward her son, expecting him to return to his coloring. Instead, he slowly stood. His small hands tightened around the crayon he still held. His breathing became quicker. His eyes never left the crystal glass resting inches from Vincent's hand. At that exact moment, Vincent reached forward, wrapped his fingers around the stem of the glass, and lifted it calmly toward his lips. Time seemed to hesitate. Elijah suddenly broke into a run across the polished marble floor, his tiny footsteps echoing louder than anyone thought possible. Before Naomi could even call his name, the little boy threw himself between the table and the Mafia Boss, both hands striking the crystal glass just as Vincent began to raise it. The expensive glass spun through the air, shattered against the marble floor, and the entire dining hall fell into absolute silence. Every conversation stopped. Every pair of eyes turned toward the frightened toddler standing protectively in front of the most powerful man in the room. Elijah's chest rose and fell as he looked directly at Vincent with trembling eyes and whispered the words that no one there would ever forget. "Don't drink that, sir." 48 hours earlier, the Castellano estate had been as quiet as a cathedral before sunrise, its marble hallways glowing beneath the first rays of morning as Naomi Carter stepped through the staff entrance carrying a worn canvas tote in one hand and holding Elijah's tiny fingers with the other. Every weekday began the same way. She signed the attendance sheet at exactly 6 o'clock, tied her neatly pressed apron, whispered a promise to her son that the day would pass quickly, and hoped no one would complain that she had brought him along again. Life had not given Naomi the luxury of choices. After Elijah's father walked away before the little boy celebrated his first birthday, she worked every job she could find until the position at the Castellano estate offered something she had almost forgotten existed: stability. The pay covered rent for their modest apartment on the south side of Chicago, groceries, daycare whenever it was available, and enough left over to slowly build a small savings account that Naomi refused to touch unless absolutely necessary. She cleaned rooms larger than the apartment she called home, polished grand staircases that reflected her own tired face every morning, and carefully dusted artwork worth more than everything she owned combined. Yet she never envied any of it. She simply reminded herself that every polished table, every folded towel, and every spotless window brought Elijah one step closer to a better future. The other employees respected Naomi because she never complained. She arrived early, stayed late whenever needed, and quietly helped co-workers without expecting recognition. Even Mrs. Alvarez, the demanding head housekeeper whose standards intimidated almost everyone, had begun trusting Naomi with responsibilities normally reserved for senior staff. The only concern anyone ever mentioned was Elijah. Although he was remarkably calm for a 2-year-old, bringing a child into one of the city's most secure private residences always carried risks. Surprisingly, Vincent Castellano never objected. In fact, Naomi had only seen him a handful of times during her first 3 months of employment. Each encounter lasted no more than a few seconds. He would pass through the hallway surrounded by advisors or security personnel, acknowledge the staff with a brief nod, and continue without unnecessary conversation. Rumors about him filled every break room. Some described him as cold beyond reason. Others insisted he quietly paid medical bills for longtime employees without allowing anyone to know the source of the money. Naomi ignored the stories because experience had taught her that powerful people were often more complicated than gossip allowed. Elijah, however, viewed the estate through entirely different eyes. While adults admired imported chandeliers and priceless paintings, he noticed birds building nests outside second-floor windows, the old groundskeeper who always carried peppermints in his pocket, and the golden retriever named Bruno, who patiently followed the gardeners every afternoon. He greeted everyone with shy smiles and endless curiosity, asking innocent questions about clocks, flowers, and why the fountain sounded different after rain. More than once, staff members laughed softly after discovering the toddler had pointed out a loose cabinet hinge, a leaking garden hose, or a forgotten package sitting beside the delivery gate long before any adult realized they were there. Mrs. Alvarez jokingly called him her little inspector, although Naomi always reminded Elijah not to wander or interrupt anyone working. The little boy always nodded seriously, promising he would stay close. Still, there was something unusual about Elijah that Naomi could never quite explain. Sometimes he noticed details so small they escaped everyone else. A misplaced photograph, a strange smell drifting through an open doorway, a missing key hanging on the maintenance board. They were ordinary observations that often proved surprisingly important later, and while Naomi smiled at the coincidence, she never imagined those quiet instincts would soon place her son at the center of an evening that would change all of their lives forever. By late afternoon, the estate had begun transforming for the evening reception. Fresh white roses arrived by the dozens, polished silver trays lined the kitchen counters, and chefs moved with quiet urgency as the aroma of rosemary, butter, and freshly baked bread drifted through the enormous service hall. Naomi worked alongside the other house staff without slowing for a single moment, carefully ironing linen napkins before carrying them into the formal dining room one perfect stack at a time. Elijah remained close to the service entrance, entertaining himself with wooden building blocks one of the kitchen assistants had given him. Every few minutes he glanced toward his mother, always making certain she remained within sight. Naomi smiled whenever she caught him watching her. She had raised him to understand that staying close meant staying safe. As preparations continued, unfamiliar faces began appearing throughout the mansion. Additional servers had been hired through an outside hospitality agency because the guest list had grown larger than expected. They all wore matching black uniforms identical to those of the regular staff, making it difficult to distinguish longtime employees from temporary workers. Mrs. Alvarez quietly handed everyone their assignments while reminding them that tonight required absolute professionalism. No mistakes, no delays, no unnecessary conversations. Naomi accepted her tray assignment without complaint and returned to work. Elijah, however, became unusually quiet. His bright curiosity faded as his eyes followed one particular server crossing the hallway. The man looked perfectly ordinary, carrying folded table linens with calm confidence. Yet Elijah continued watching him long after he disappeared through the dining room doors. A few minutes later, the same man emerged carrying nothing at all, glancing briefly over one shoulder before walking toward the kitchen. Elijah frowned. He had seen enough adults carrying heavy objects to know people usually returned with empty hands only after delivering them. Something about the man's movements felt different, although the toddler could not explain why. He simply continued watching. Naomi noticed her son's serious expression and knelt beside him for a moment. "What is it, sweetheart?" she asked softly. Elijah pointed toward the hallway. "That man." Naomi looked but saw only busy employees preparing for the evening. She gently brushed a curl away from Elijah's forehead and smiled. "Everyone is working today. Stay here, okay?" Elijah nodded because he always listened to his mother, but his eyes drifted back toward the dining room. As sunset painted warm orange light across the mansion windows, the guests finally began arriving. Luxury sedans rolled through the front gates one after another, while security officers welcomed each visitor with quiet efficiency. Elegant laughter gradually filled the entrance hall. Crystal glasses caught the golden light. Expensive shoes echoed across polished marble floors. The atmosphere felt refined, controlled, almost effortless. Hidden beneath that polished surface, however, tiny details continued gathering like scattered pieces of a puzzle. Elijah watched the unfamiliar server pass by again, this time carrying a silver tray with only a single wine glass resting upon it. Instead of placing it directly on the dining table, the man paused for the briefest instant near a sideboard where another identical glass already stood waiting. His body blocked the view for barely a heartbeat before he continued walking as though nothing unusual had happened. No adult seemed to notice. They were too busy greeting distinguished guests, adjusting place settings, or reviewing schedules. Elijah's small eyebrows tightened. He had watched people play matching games with colored blocks often enough to recognize when something changed. The glass that reached the table did not look like the one that had left the sideboard. He tugged gently on Naomi's sleeve as she hurried past carrying polished silverware. "Mommy," he whispered, "that glass is wrong." Naomi glanced down with affectionate patience, but barely slowed her pace. "Not now, baby. We will talk after work." Elijah remained standing beside the doorway, his eyes fixed on the glittering dining room, unable to explain why every instinct inside him suddenly told him that someone he barely knew was about to make a terrible mistake. The final guests settled into their seats as the last rays of sunlight disappeared beyond the towering oak trees surrounding the estate. Soft piano music drifted through hidden speakers while candles flickered against crystal centerpieces, filling the dining room with an atmosphere of effortless sophistication. Every movement appeared perfectly choreographed. Servers delivered each course with practiced precision. Glasses were refilled before anyone needed to ask, and conversations flowed easily between influential business leaders who believed they were enjoying nothing more than another elegant evening. Vincent Castellano remained composed at the head of the table, listening more than speaking, his calm presence naturally drawing the attention of everyone around him. Naomi continued moving quietly between guests, careful not to interrupt a single conversation. She had almost forgotten Elijah's earlier concern until she noticed him no longer sitting beside his coloring book. A sudden wave of worry tightened her chest. She scanned the room and finally spotted him standing near the open doorway, his wide brown eyes fixed on the dining table with an intensity no child should have carried. Before she could reach him, Elijah slowly stepped forward. His tiny face had lost every trace of childish curiosity. Instead, it showed confusion mixed with fear. Across the room, one of the temporary servers approached Vincent with a polished silver tray. Resting upon it was a freshly poured glass of deep red wine that caught the candlelight like liquid ruby. The server lowered the tray with flawless confidence, offered a respectful nod, and quietly stepped away. Nothing about the moment appeared unusual to anyone else. Guests continued discussing investments, charitable foundations, and upcoming projects while gentle laughter echoed beneath the high ceilings. Naomi finally reached Elijah and softly placed her hand on his shoulder. "Sweetheart, you need to stay with me," she whispered. Instead of answering, Elijah kept staring toward the glass. His breathing became noticeably quicker. His small fingers wrapped tightly around the edge of Naomi's apron. "Mommy," he whispered, almost too quietly to hear. It changed again. Naomi followed his gaze toward the table, but saw nothing, except Vincent reaching calmly for his wine. She forced a reassuring smile, believing her son had simply become overwhelmed by the unfamiliar environment. "Everything is fine," she murmured. "Come with me." Elijah did not move. Every instinct inside him told him something was terribly wrong, even though he could not explain why. He remembered the unfamiliar server stopping beside the sideboard. He remembered one glass becoming another. He remembered the strange feeling that settled in his stomach the moment the tray reached the dining room. Vincent lifted the crystal stem between his fingers while continuing his conversation with the distinguished guest seated beside him. Around the table, several people raised their own glasses in anticipation of a formal toast celebrating new partnerships and lasting trust. Chairs shifted softly across polished marble. Crystal chimed gently against crystal. Naomi began guiding Elijah back toward the service entrance, believing the evening had finally returned to normal. Then the little boy looked directly at Vincent's glass one final time. Something inside him refused to stay silent. Before Naomi could tighten her grip, Elijah slipped free from her hand and ran across the dining room with surprising speed. Every step echoed through the suddenly quiet hall. Guests turned in confusion as the toddler raced straight toward the head of the table. Naomi called his name in panic, but he never slowed. Vincent had already begun raising the glass toward his lips when Elijah reached him. Stretching upward with every ounce of strength his little body possessed, the boy struck the bottom of the crystal glass. It spun through the air before shattering harmlessly across the marble floor. Silence swallowed the room so completely that the soft crackle of candle flames seemed impossibly loud. Elijah stood trembling before Vincent, tears filling his eyes as he struggled to catch his breath. Looking up at the man everyone else feared, the little boy spoke with absolute certainty. "Please, do not drink it." No one moved. The shattered crystal lay scattered across the polished marble like tiny stars reflecting the candlelight, while the deep red wine slowly spread across the floor in silent waves. Every conversation had vanished. The musicians stopped playing without being asked. Even the kitchen staff standing beyond the double doors remained perfectly still, sensing that something extraordinary had just interrupted the evening. Naomi hurried forward, her face pale with embarrassment as she gently wrapped her arms around Elijah. "I am so sorry, sir," she said, her voice trembling despite every effort to remain composed. "He is only a child. I promise he did not mean to interrupt your dinner." She expected anger. She expected dismissal. Perhaps even the loss of the only stable job she had ever managed to keep. Instead, Vincent Castellano remained seated, his calm blue eyes fixed not on the broken glass but on the frightened little boy standing before him. There was no frustration in his expression, only quiet curiosity. "Why did you stop me?" Vincent asked softly. The room seemed to lean closer. Elijah swallowed hard before answering. It was not the same glass. Several guests exchanged puzzled glances. One executive smiled awkwardly, assuming the child had simply become confused. Another quietly suggested that perhaps the excitement of the evening had overwhelmed him. Naomi knelt beside her son and gently squeezed his shoulders. "Elijah," she whispered kindly, "tell the truth." The little boy looked directly into his mother's eyes before turning back toward Vincent. "I am telling the truth." His tiny voice never rose above a whisper, yet every person in the dining room heard every word. The man changed it. Vincent slowly shifted his attention toward the line of temporary servers standing silently against the wall. Their faces remained professional, but one of them briefly lowered his eyes before quickly looking away again. It lasted less than a second. Most people would never have noticed. Vincent did. Years of reading expressions across negotiation tables had taught him that fear often revealed itself in the smallest movements. He calmly looked back toward Elijah. "Which man?" he asked. The toddler raised one small finger and pointed across the room without hesitation. Every head turned at once. The server who had delivered the wine stood perfectly still beside the silver service card, his expression carefully controlled. Mrs. Alvarez frowned in confusion. "That cannot be correct," she said quietly. "He arrived through the staffing agency this afternoon. His credentials were verified." Vincent never answered. Instead, he slowly stood from his chair, smoothing the front of his jacket with the same calm precision he had shown all evening. The dining room remained silent enough to hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. "Bring me the serving tray," Vincent said. His voice remained steady, almost gentle, making the request sound more like simple curiosity than suspicion. One of the senior butlers carefully retrieved the polished silver tray that had carried the wine. Vincent examined it without touching anything else. Near the edge of the tray, barely visible beneath the candlelight, rested a tiny, clear droplet that had not completely dried. He looked toward the head sommelier. "Did you prepare every glass yourself?" The older man immediately nodded. "Yes, sir. Every bottle was opened inside the wine cellar under supervision." Vincent's eyes returned to the unfamiliar server. "Then explain why one glass appears to have taken a different path before reaching my table." For the first time all evening, uncertainty spread through the room like an invisible wave. No accusations had been made. No voices had been raised. Yet everyone sensed that the elegant celebration had quietly become something entirely different. Naomi held Elijah a little closer, still uncertain whether her son had saved the evening from disaster or had simply uncovered a mystery that no one inside the magnificent estate had ever imagined was waiting beneath its polished surface. The unfamiliar server did not answer immediately. Instead, he offered a polite smile that seemed perfectly appropriate for someone who believed a simple misunderstanding had interrupted an elegant evening. "Sir," he said calmly, "I only carried the glass that was handed to me by the wine station." His voice remained steady, but Vincent noticed what Elijah had noticed long before anyone else. The man's eyes never settled. They moved from the silver tray to the broken glass, then toward the service hallway, as though quietly measuring the distance to the nearest exit. Vincent did not accuse him. He simply looked toward Anthony Russo, the longtime chief of security who had protected the Castellano estate for nearly 2 decades. Anthony understood the silent instruction immediately and walked toward the service entrance with 2 members of his team, not to confront anyone, but to quietly close every exit leading from the dining wing. The guests remained seated, uncertain whether they were witnessing an unfortunate misunderstanding or something far more serious. Naomi held Elijah close against her side, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear the grandfather clock marking another minute. She wanted to leave, to disappear into the staff quarters, yet something told her the evening was far from over. Vincent crouched until he was almost at eye level with Elijah, his expression softer than anyone in the room had ever seen. "Tell me exactly what you saw," he said gently. Elijah blinked, thinking carefully before speaking. The man put one glass down. Then he stood in front of it. When he moved, it was a different glass. Vincent nodded slowly. "How do you know it was different?" Elijah pointed toward the dining table. "This one had a tiny bubble in the stem. The first one did not." Several guests leaned forward instinctively. The head sommelier immediately retrieved another matching glass from the serving station and compared it with the shattered base still resting on the floor. His experienced eyes widened almost instantly. "Sir," he said quietly, "the child is correct." He lifted the broken stem carefully. "These glasses come from 2 different crystal collections. They appear almost identical, but they were manufactured years apart. We only use the newer set during formal dinners." Mrs. Alvarez covered her mouth in disbelief. She had personally inspected every place setting that afternoon. There should never have been a mismatched glass anywhere near the table. Anthony returned moments later carrying a small clipboard from the temporary staffing agency. His expression remained controlled, but his voice became noticeably firmer. "We have a problem." Every eye turned toward him. One employee listed on today's staffing schedule never arrived. Yet someone signed in using his name and identification. Silence settled over the dining room once again. Vincent slowly looked toward the unfamiliar server. The polite smile had disappeared. Before anyone could speak, another member of the security team entered carrying a small insulated service container discovered beside the sideboard Elijah had been watching earlier. "Sir," The guard said respectfully. This was found behind the wine station. It does not belong to our catering equipment. Vincent did not touch the container. Instead, he requested that it remain sealed until specialists could examine it properly. His decisions remained measured, careful, and deliberate. He refused to let assumptions replace evidence. The guests watched quietly as the evening transformed from celebration into careful investigation without a single raised voice. Naomi lowered her eyes, still overwhelmed by the realization that everyone now believed the observations of a 2-year-old child. Vincent looked once more at Elijah, who stood silently beside his mother clutching the same blue crayon he had carried all evening. The little boy had not acted out of fear or confusion. He had simply trusted what he had seen when every adult had been distracted by appearances. And for the first time that night, Vincent began wondering how many other truths had quietly passed before his own eyes simply because no one had thought to look as carefully as a child. Anthony quietly escorted the unfamiliar server into a nearby sitting room while the remaining guests stayed inside the dining hall under the careful supervision of the estate staff. No voices were raised. No dramatic accusations echoed through the mansion. Vincent insisted that everyone be treated with dignity until the facts spoke for themselves. It was the same principle that had guided every difficult decision he had made for years. Truth carried far more weight than assumptions. Minutes later, the estate's security specialists began reviewing footage from dozens of cameras positioned throughout the property. Large monitors illuminated the control room with soft blue light as every recording from the previous 2 hours played simultaneously. Anthony slowed one particular camera overlooking the service corridor. There it was. The temporary server paused beside the antique sideboard exactly where Elijah had pointed earlier. For less than 3 seconds, his body blocked the camera's view. Then he continued walking toward the dining room, carrying what appeared to be the same tray. Anthony replayed the recording several times. On the surface, nothing looked suspicious. But Vincent noticed a nearly invisible detail. Before stepping away, the man briefly reached toward the lower shelf of the sideboard where decorative serving pieces had been displayed earlier that afternoon. Anthony immediately dispatched another employee to inspect the furniture more carefully. Hidden behind a folded linen cloth rested a velvet pouch containing a crystal wine glass from the estate's retired collection, identical to the shattered stem Elijah had recognized. Mrs. Alvarez slowly lowered herself into a nearby chair, unable to hide her disbelief. "That cabinet has not been opened in months," she whispered. "Only senior staff even know those glasses are stored there." The discovery changed everything. Someone familiar with the estate had clearly planned every detail long before the evening began. Meanwhile, another security officer confirmed that the identification used by the temporary server belonged to a hospitality worker whose wallet had recently been reported missing. The real employee had never arrived because he had never accepted the assignment in the first place. Every answer uncovered another carefully hidden layer of planning. Vincent listened without interrupting. His expression remained calm, but inside he recognized something more troubling than a simple security breach. Whoever organized the deception had studied his routines, understood the estate's traditions, and trusted that everyone would be too distracted by appearances to notice a tiny difference between two nearly identical crystal glasses. Everyone except a curious little boy. Vincent returned to the dining room, where Naomi sat quietly beside Elijah, still unsure whether they should remain or leave. She immediately stood when Vincent approached. "Sir," she said softly, "if bringing Elijah here caused trouble for your guests, I accept full responsibility." Vincent looked at her for a long moment before slowly shaking his head. "Your son prevented me from ignoring something every adult in this room overlooked." Naomi glanced down at Elijah, who nervously held his blue crayon against his chest. Vincent knelt once more until they were face to face. "Can you tell me one more thing?" he asked. Elijah nodded. "When you saw the man changing the glass, why did you not stay quiet?" The little boy answered without hesitation. "Because you smiled at Mommy yesterday." Vincent blinked in surprise. Elijah continued in the simple honesty only a child could possess. "Mommy said kind people should be helped. You were kind." The words settled over the room with unexpected weight. Naomi covered her mouth, her eyes filling with quiet emotion. Around them, executives, staff members, and security officers lowered their gaze in thoughtful silence. They had spent the entire evening discussing evidence, procedures, and careful observations. Yet the purest explanation came from the smallest voice in the mansion. Elijah had not acted because of power, fear, or reward. He had acted because he believed kindness deserved protection. And in that quiet realization, Vincent understood that the greatest strength inside his estate had never been the walls, the cameras, or the security teams. It had been the courage of one little child who refused to ignore what everyone else had failed to see. The formal investigation concluded well after midnight, but the atmosphere inside the Castellano estate no longer carried the weight of suspicion. Instead, it was filled with quiet reflection. The distinguished guests departed one by one, each offering Vincent respectful farewells before disappearing into the cool Chicago night. The grand dining hall, once alive with elegant conversation, slowly returned to silence as staff carefully cleared untouched plates and extinguished the candles that had burned throughout the unforgettable evening. Naomi remained behind, helping the housekeeping team restore the room exactly as it had looked only hours before. Although everyone treated her with unexpected kindness, she could not escape the worry growing inside her heart. She knew that bringing Elijah to work had violated the spirit of the estate's rules, even if extraordinary circumstances had forced her to do so. Before leaving for the night, she quietly approached Mrs. Alvarez and handed over her employee identification badge. "Please give this to Mr. Castellano," she said softly. "I understand if he decides another family would be a better fit for this position." Mrs. Alvarez looked at the badge but did not take it immediately. "You should wait until morning," she replied. Naomi simply smiled with quiet dignity. "Whatever decision he makes, I will respect it." Holding Elijah's hand, she walked toward the staff entrance without looking back. The following morning, Naomi returned to the estate only because she believed it was the honorable thing to do. She wanted to thank everyone for their patience before collecting the few personal belongings she kept inside her employee locker. Instead of finding an empty hallway, she found Anthony Russo waiting near the entrance with an expression far warmer than she had ever seen on his face. "Mr. Castellano would like to see you in his study," he said politely. Naomi's stomach tightened as she followed him through the familiar marble corridors. Elijah walked quietly beside her, clutching the same blue crayon that somehow had become part of the previous evening's extraordinary story. Vincent stood beside the tall windows overlooking the estate gardens, morning sunlight filling the room with soft golden light. He turned as they entered and motioned for them to sit, but Naomi remained standing. "Sir," she began carefully, "before you say anything, I want to apologize for bringing Elijah. I understand the responsibility was mine." Vincent shook his head gently. "Yesterday, you believed you might lose your job because your son interrupted an important dinner." He paused before continuing. "The truth is that he protected every person sitting at that table from making a mistake they could never have undone." Naomi lowered her eyes, unsure how to respond. Vincent walked to his desk and placed a small envelope in front of her. Inside was not money, but a new employment contract. The position listed beneath her name was no longer housekeeping assistant. It read household operations supervisor. Naomi looked up in complete disbelief. Vincent smiled faintly. "Mrs. Alvarez recommended you weeks ago because of your work ethic. Last night only confirmed what she already knew. I need someone who notices details, earns trust, and leads with integrity." Naomi's hands trembled as she held the document. Before she could speak, Vincent reached into another drawer and removed a small brass key attached to a leather tag. "This opens the family apartment prepared for senior household managers on the east side of the estate," he explained. "It has 2 bedrooms, a small garden, and enough space for a little boy who enjoys watching birds and asking impossible questions." Elijah looked up with wide eyes. "Does it have flowers?" Vincent nodded. "It does now." For the first time since arriving at the Castellano estate months earlier, Naomi allowed herself to believe that she was no longer simply surviving. She was finally being seen. 1 year later, the east garden of the Castellano estate looked nothing like it had before. Bright tulips lined the stone pathways, young maple trees stretched toward the spring sunshine, and dozens of colorful birds gathered every morning beside the small wooden feeder that Elijah insisted on filling himself before breakfast. What had once been an unused corner of the property had quietly become everyone's favorite place to begin the day. Naomi often smiled as she watched gardeners, chefs, security officers, and office staff stop for a few minutes simply to enjoy the peaceful space the little boy had inspired. Life inside the estate had changed in countless small ways after that unforgettable evening. Every temporary employee now completed additional security verification. Every serving station followed new procedures, and every member of the household understood that careful observation mattered just as much as experience. Yet Vincent often reminded everyone that the most important lesson had nothing to do with cameras or protocols. It was about never overlooking the quiet voices in the room. Under Naomi's leadership, the household staff flourished. She treated every employee with the same respect she had once wished someone would show her, remembering every name, celebrating every birthday, and quietly helping new workers settle into unfamiliar surroundings. Mrs. Alvarez proudly admitted she had never seen the estate operate with greater unity. Respect had replaced fear, and excellence followed naturally. On a warm Saturday afternoon, the entire household gathered in the garden to celebrate Elijah's third birthday. Long wooden tables were decorated with fresh flowers picked from the estate grounds. Children laughed while chasing colorful balloons across the lawn, and the kitchen staff prepared homemade desserts instead of the extravagant displays usually served during formal events. Vincent arrived without the business associates or security procession that normally surrounded him. Dressed in a simple navy sweater and light gray slacks, he carried a carefully wrapped package no larger than a shoebox. Elijah ran toward him with the fearless excitement only children possess. Vincent knelt with a smile that would have surprised anyone who had known him only a year earlier. "Happy birthday, young man," he said warmly. Elijah opened the package to discover a beautifully handcrafted wooden birdhouse with tiny carved bluebirds resting beneath the roof. His face lit up with pure joy. "Can we hang it today?" he asked. Vincent nodded. Together, they walked toward the largest maple tree in the garden while everyone watched quietly. After securing the little birdhouse to a sturdy branch, Vincent stepped back and placed one hand gently on Elijah's shoulder. "Do you remember why everyone is here today?" he asked. Elijah thought carefully before smiling. "Because birthdays are for saying thank you." Vincent looked around at the gathered staff before answering softly, "Yes, and because 1 year ago, a little boy reminded an entire house that courage does not depend on age, position, or power." Naomi felt tears gather as she watched the people surrounding her applaud, not because anyone instructed them to, but because gratitude had become something genuine. The gardeners clapped beside the accountants. The chefs smiled beside the security officers. Mrs. Alvarez quietly wiped her eyes. No one saw a maid standing there anymore. They saw a respected leader, a devoted mother, and the child whose honesty had transformed an entire household. As the afternoon breeze stirred the new leaves overhead, a pair of bluebirds landed on the roof of the little wooden house before singing softly into the quiet garden. Elijah laughed with delight, and Vincent smiled toward Naomi before speaking words that remained with everyone long after the celebration ended. Buildings are protected by walls. Families are protected by trust. And sometimes, the strongest guardian in the room is the one everyone underestimated. In that peaceful moment, surrounded by sunlight, laughter, and simple kindness, the estate remembered forever what true dignity looked like.